From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Last week, my attorneys and I filed a claim against Harvard. I'm asking for the return of my enslaved ancestors' images, and the complaint is more than just a complaint about images. It's a history lesson, and specifically it points to the exploitation of slaves and how universities like Harvard continue to profit.
Who has the right to own photos of slaves? We'll speak with Tamara Lanier, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Papa Renti, the enslaved man whose image was captured in a 19th century photograph currently owned by Harvard. We'll also speak with her attorney, Benjamin Crump. Then Albert Woodfox was the longest-standing solitary confinement prisoner in the United States. He was held 43 years in isolation in a 6 by 9 foot cell until he was released just over 2 years ago. Today, he joins us in studio with his new memoir, Solitary, Unbroken by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, my story of transformation and hope.
Well, solitary confinement is probably the most brutal form of torture, non-physical torture, because the primary effect is mentally, emotionally. As for now, you know, my life, since I've been free now 3 years, and everything is first-time experiences.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New York State has announced a sweeping lawsuit against members of the Sackler family, the owner of Purdue Pharma, which makes OxyContin, the highly addictive drug at the center of the opioid epidemic. New York Attorney General Letitia James accused the Sacklers of masterminding a scheme that, quote, literally profited off of suffering and death. This is James speaking at a news conference Thursday.
And as Purdue sold more and more opioids, the Sackler family transferred more and more and more wealth to their personal accounts. And as the lawsuits have piled up against the Sackler family and Purdue for their roles in this crisis, they continue to move funds into trust and, yes, offshore accounts.
Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family are facing multiple lawsuits. A group of over 500 cities, counties, and Native American tribes filed a lawsuit against the Sacklers last week, accusing them of lying about the dangers of OxyContin and deceitful marketing of the drug. The New York suit names 5 other opioid manufacturers, including Johnson & Johnson and the Israeli company Teva. The Justice Department said Thursday special counsel Robert Mueller's full report is over 300 pages long as Democrats continue to call for its full release as well as the underlying evidence. Democrats argue Attorney General William Barr's 4-page summary released just 2 days after receiving Mueller's report cannot be trusted and question his conclusion that Trump did not obstruct justice, a charge Mueller did not reach a definitive conclusion on. Barr reportedly told House Judiciary Chair Gerald Nadler he would not commit to sharing the full report. He's currently redacting the report, which could take weeks, meaning he will likely miss Democrats' stated deadline of next Tuesday to hand it over. The Department of Housing and Urban Development suing Facebook for violating the Fair Housing Act. HUD says Facebook allows companies that advertise housing on social media platform to block their ads from select groups of users based on factors such as race, religion, gender, and disability. Some of the categories available to advertisers include foreigners or people selected Hispanic culture or hijab fashion as an interest. Facebook says it's working on the issue. Last week, the company reached a settlement with civil rights groups agreeing to overhaul its micro-targeting system to curb discriminatory advertising. HUD is reportedly also reviewing Twitter and Google's targeted advertising practices. The war of words between President Trump and Puerto Rican Governor Ricardo Rosselló heated up Thursday, 2 days after Trump told Republican lawmakers Puerto Rico has received too much aid since 2017's devastating Hurricane Maria. This is Governor Rosselló speaking to CNN's Jim Acosta.
Does it feel that way sometimes? That you're dealing with a bully? If the bully gets close, I'll punch the bully in the mouth.
In response, Trump told reporters, "I've taken better care of Puerto Rico than anyone ever." President Trump has still not acknowledged more than 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico after the hurricane. In the Philippines, award-winning journalist Maria Ressa has been freed on bail after authorities arrested her Friday for the second time in 2 months. The arrest stems from charges barring foreign ownership of press, an accusation Ressa denies. Ressa is the founder of the independent news site Rappler and a vocal critic of the Philippines' authoritarian President Rodrigo Duterte and his war on drugs, which has killed thousands of people. Ressa spoke to reporters after her release.
You cannot harass and intimidate journalists to silence. We'll stand up and fight against it. And as long as we are a democracy under a constitution which has a Bill of Rights, we will demand our rights be respected.
And then tell me. In Venezuela, the government of President Nicolas Maduro has banned opposition leader and self-proclaimed interim President Juan Guaido from running for public office for 15 years. Venezuelan government officials cited irregularities in Guaido's financial disclosures. The opposition leader dismissed the charge and called on his supporters to keep taking to the streets. In Saudi Arabia, authorities temporarily freed 3 of the 11 women activists who were imprisoned on what human rights groups say are trumped-up charges. Among other issues, they were protesting Saudi Arabia's ban on women drivers. Their arrest 10 months ago came just weeks before the kingdom lifted the ban. Some of the women have reported physical and sexual abuse while imprisoned. In Somalia, a car bomb detonated on a busy road by a hotel and restaurants in the capital Mogadishu Thursday, killing at least 15 people and wounding 17 others, according to local reports. Al-Shabaab militants claim responsibility for the attack. This is a witness and Mogadishu residents speaking after the deadly attack.
As a mother, it is shocking for me, and I request those behind the explosions to stop. We are crying every day over dead bodies, and it is very hard for us to talk about.
The attack comes just days after a car bomb and a gun battle between security forces and al-Shabaab militants killed at least 15 people at a government building in Mogadishu. In news from Egypt, pro-democracy activist and blogger Alaa Abdel Fattah was freed from prison after 5 years. He was convicted of inciting a 2013 protest that broke a law barring public gatherings without government approval. He still faces 5 years probation, which means he will have to spend 12 hours in a police station every night. Just 2 weeks away from the new Brexit deadline, British lawmakers will vote on a framework for Britain's relationship with the European Union through the end of 2020. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Theresa May said she would step down if her deal, which was already rejected twice by lawmakers, passed in Parliament. Lawmakers on both sides fear the failure of today's vote could result in a dreaded no-deal Brexit. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned leaders to come to an upcoming climate summit with concrete plans to stem climate change as the UN presented a new report by the World Meteorological Organization Thursday.
Every week brings a new example of climate-related devastation. No country or community is immune. And, as is always the case, the poor and vulnerable are the first to suffer and the worst hit. Global climate marches are sending a clear message. Young people are demanding that today's leaders act on behalf of future generations. I echo that demand.
President Trump told reporters Thursday he's reversing a proposed budget cut to the Special Olympics after Education Secretary Betsy DeVos came under fire for requesting government zero out its funding for the 3rd straight year. "I've overridden my people," Trump told reporters. In healthcare news, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. struck down a Trump administration rule enabling so-called association health plans, which allows small businesses to jointly offer less expensive and more restrictive health plans outside the Affordable Care Act. Trump promoted the rule to business owners as a way to circumvent the ACA and save money. The ruling comes just days after the Justice Department argued the ACA should be fully overturned, siding with a Texas judge who declared President Barack Obama's signature health law unconstitutional last December. Wells Fargo CEO Tim Sloan stepping down as the banking giant faces multiple scandals related to its predatory lending practices and misleading and defrauding customers. Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted in response to the news, quote, "About damn time. Tim Sloan should have been fired a long time ago. He enabled Wells Fargo's massive fake account scam, got rich off it, and then helped cover it up. Now let's make sure all the people hurt by Wells Fargo's scams get the relief they're owed," unquote. Earlier this month, Democratic lawmakers grilled Sloan on consumer fraud as well as Wells Fargo's relationship to the NRA, private prisons, and the fossil fuel industry. The following day, Wells Fargo increased his salary to $18.4 million, including a $2 million bonus. Maryland has become the latest state to adopt the $15 minimum wage after the legislature overrode Governor Larry Hogan's veto of the bill. Companies must adopt the law by 2025 or 2026 if they have fewer than 15 employees. Maryland's now the sixth state to sign a $15 an hour minimum wage into law. And organizers in Gaza have called for a million-strong demonstration Saturday on the one-year anniversary of the start of the Great March of Return protests at the occupied enclave's separation barrier with Israel. A recent UN report found that 189 Palestinians were killed between March 30th and December 31st last year. Local reports put the total number of deaths at over 200, with thousands of others wounded. Israel has ramped up its military presence in preparation for the demonstration. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin in Massachusetts, where the descendant of two enslaved people who were captured in mid-19th century photographs has sued Harvard University, accusing the university of unfairly profiting from their images. Tamara Lanier of Connecticut argues in a lawsuit filed this month that she and other descendants of Renty and Delia, two people held in bondage 169 years ago, should hold the rights to their photographs, not Harvard. Renty and Delia were forced to pose for the photographs in 1850 by a well-known Harvard professor, Louis Agassiz, and he commissioned the images to support his theory of polygenism, which purports that human races have different origins and that Africans and African Americans were inferior to whites. The theory was used to justify the ongoing enslavement of black people prior to the Civil War, as well as segregation.
The images of Renty and Delia were used in a recent Harvard conference titled Universities and Slavery, Bound by History. This comes after administrators at Harvard and other elite universities have admitted they were founded largely through the labor of enslaved African people and profits generated by the slave trade. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. Tamara Lanier is the plaintiff in the lawsuit against Harvard University, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Renty, the enslaved man whose image was captured in the mid-19th century daguerreotype owned by Harvard. Also with us, famed civil rights lawyer Benjamin Crump, representing Tamara Lanier in the lawsuit against Harvard University over the images of her ancestors. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Tamara, let's begin with you. Explain how you discovered that Harvard had these photographs of your relatives, of your ancestors.
It's quite an amazing story that started with a request by my mother that I document our lineage, our genealogy. And at her passing, I set out to do exactly that. And that was in 2010, where the Internet wasn't as, the information wasn't as readily available as today. And I happened to be out walking for lunch one afternoon, and I stopped into a small ice cream shop, and I was speaking with the owner about my dilemma, and he offered to help. And it was actually him, Richard Morrison of Norwich, who found the images on the Internet.
Found the images. And how did you know that Renty was your great-great-great-grandfather?
As a child, my mom often talked about her enslaved ancestors, particularly the man in the image who she fondly referred to as Papa Renty. And she also talked about the fact of our lineage, how our family was broken apart by slavery. She remembered some of the family names. And so when I met with Rich that afternoon, I gave him the names and the information that my mom had shared with me. And I didn't return to the ice cream shop for a while thereafter, but when I did return, he said he had found amazing information on the internet, and particularly a picture of my grandfather. And the images, the information that Rich sent me included a narrative about who Louis Agassiz was, but he sent me an email with a number of links, and I remember reading the information about Louis Agassiz and being overwhelmed and shocked by it. And then when I opened the link to the picture of Renty, it was a moment for me because I knew immediately that this was the man that I had heard so much about throughout my childhood.
And Benjamin Crump, could you talk about what you know of how Harvard acquired or utilized these photographs, and why your lawsuit argues that they never legally owned the images that they're profiting from?
Certainly. It was the director, Steve McQueen, who told the story of Solomon Northup in his Oscar-winning movie 12 Years a Slave. Well, Renty is 169 years a slave, and the basic questions that our lawsuit asks is, one, how long will Harvard continue to condone slavery? And two, when will Harvard University finally free Renty? Harvard University's professor, Louis Agassiz, was a racist. While Abraham Lincoln was talking about Emancipation Proclamation, he was going around the country professing that he could prove scientifically that black people were inferior to white people. He was an equal opportunity bigot because he also fought to keep Jews and people from Ireland out of Harvard University. But in particular, he was focused on black people, proving that they were inferior. And so he wrote all these horrible things about black people to justify the continued enslavement of black people. And he sought to obtain ocular proof. And that's why he went down to South Carolina, because he was looking for pure African, because after the ban on transporting slaves and importing slaves into America in 1807, many of the slave masters had sexually assaulted and raped so many black women that there were very few pure Africans, as Louis Agassiz had noted. So he went to Charleston, South Carolina, and started looking there, but he found in Columbia, South Carolina, at Benjamin Franklin Taylor's plantation, Renty and his daughter Delia, and they were referred to as the Black African. And I remember Tamara asking her mother, well, why do they call them the Black African? We're all from Africa. She did not know at that time about Louis Agassiz, and that he was referred to as the Black African because everybody knew that he was a pure African, and this is what Louis Agassiz had been looking for to support his racist beliefs.
And in terms of how Harvard only discovered these photographs, right? That they were stored in a file cabinet in one of its museums back about 40 years ago. Could you talk about how they've used them since?
Yes, sir. Harvard has used the pictures. They've licensed them. These daguerreotypes are very, very valuable. They are the earliest known photographs of American slaves, and some of the earliest known photographs in America using this daguerreotype. And so Harvard had licensed them to be used in films. They were seen apparently in the movie Roots, and they've been used in several books. They are located in the Peabody Museum that charges reproduction fees and such. But really, it is priceless to Mara Lanier and her family because they're the lineal descendants. And when Abraham Lincoln and the United States government freed black people in America, we didn't have any land. We didn't have 40 acres and a mule. We at least believed when we were free, we had the right and ownership to our person. And incumbent in that was our image. But Harvard is telling Miss Lanier and her family, no, Renty still belongs to us. He's still our property. And so this lawsuit just isn't about Tamara and the lineal descendants of Renty. It really is about the lineal descendants of all African slaves in America, because slavery was meant to make sure that we had no familiar pedigree, that we could not trace our lineage. That's why they would break up the male and the female after they procreated, and they would take the children from their parents because they did not want us to have a concept of family. They wanted us to think of ourselves only as property. And that's why it's so miraculous what Miss Lanier has done and being able to prove the lineal descendants, of her family, because many of us black people in America, we cannot do that because the primary foundation of slavery was to make sure we couldn't do that when they sold us off and changed our last names to whoever the plantation owner was.
In 2016, Harvard University installed a plaque to commemorate 4 enslaved people who lived and worked at Wadsworth House, the one-time home of Harvard presidents. In an article for the Harvard Crimson, then Harvard President Drew Faust wrote, quote, "Slavery is an aspect of Harvard's past that has rarely been acknowledged or invoked, but Harvard was directly complicit in America's system of racial bondage from the college's earliest days," unquote. This is Harvard University former President Faust speaking at the unveiling of the plaque.
Today we will unveil a plaque that will document the presence of 4 enslaved individuals in the households of 2 Harvard presidents who lived in Wadsworth House. Titus, Venus, Bilhah, and Juba lived there too. The plaque is intended to remember them and honor them, and to remind us that slavery was not an abstraction, but a cruelty inflicted on particular humans. The past never dies or disappears. It continues to shape us in ways we should not try to erase or ignore. We must never forget.
So that's past Harvard University President Drew Faust speaking at the unveiling of this plaque. Tamara Lanier, as you hear her speak, your thoughts?
Well, interestingly enough, I received notice of that meeting from someone on social media, and I wrote to her and asked if I could attend that event, and I was denied, or I was told no. What resonates with me in that statement is when she talks about the past will never die and it will continue to shape us in ways that we shouldn't ignore or forget. That's exactly what she did with Renty and his legacy. At that time, she knew about Renty. She knew about me. She knew the stories that I've shared with everyone else. And I specifically asked her, why is it that Harvard, the keeper of these images, is seemingly not interested when the entire world is amazed? And that would have been a great opportunity to reference their legacy with slavery in Renty. But every time they had the opportunity to do the right thing by Renty, they chose not to.
I wanted to ask you about that because this lawsuit comes after numerous attempts by you to contact different parts of Harvard University to try to get some response. Yes. Could you talk about that, who you reached out to, and what led you finally to say, I have to file a lawsuit?
Virtually everyone. I sent emails. I think ultimately Dr. Faust was the last person at Harvard I reached out to. At that time, I think there was the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. I spoke with Professor Charles. At that time, he was professor, not doctor. He may have been Dr. Charles Ogletree. I sent emails to Henry Gates.
And what did Charles Ogletree say?
He was very supportive. He referred me to the Cambridge branch of the NAACP. I did travel to Cambridge and attended one of their meetings where this was discussed, but not really much traction from that resource. I wrote to history departments, history professors. Again, as I explained in my email to Dr. Faust, I have sent emails almost to the point of ad nauseum and no response.
I'm curious what the response of Henry Louis Gates was, since he has spent so much time dealing with heritage and lineage and ancestry.
He didn't respond.
He didn't respond at all.
Not at all.
So, Benjamin Crump, you have called your lawsuit the most important lawsuit since Brown v. Board of Education. Talk about why.
Certainly, especially as it relates to civil rights. Attorney Mike Koskoff and I have put forth this claim based on well-established precedents of property law. We've argued replevin, conversion, unjust enrichment, and aiming something very novel to be pled in contemporary pleadings. We argue that the 13th Amendment of the United States of America, which gave blacks not only the right to be free, but also the right to own property and to enter into contracts. And so when Renty was freed in 1865, incumbent in that was his right to own his own image. This is critical when you think about what Harvard is saying, that we own the rights, not your linear descendants. Black people didn't get any inheritance from any of our family members because we were slaves. We couldn't own anything. And so this lawsuit will speak to many issues that America has never sought to grapple with. They have just assumed that the descendants of Africans should not be given anything for our contributions to this country. Our over 400 years of free labor, building this economy, bearing the cross on our back to make sure that America was able to thrive in the world. And so this lawsuit will speak to that. And if we're successful, it will be the first time that descendants of African slaves are ever given any kind of compensation, any way that the harm is being repaired from slavery. Until Harvard condemns what Agassi did, because they have never done that, there will be a stain on their legacy as one of the world's leading educational institutions. Their alumni diplomas will have a taint on it, and there will always be that asterisk there that they are continuing to condone slavery because your actions speak louder than your words. And so far, your actions to Tammy Lanier has been outrageous when you think about their dismissive nature to her. Harvard, you're better than this.
And in terms of this long history of the country failing to live up to what was done during slavery, this calls to mind the Henrietta Lack story with Johns Hopkins and them benefiting from her cells. It also comes at a time when there's at least a few, for the first time, presidential candidates actually raising the issue of reparations for descendants of slaves here in the United States. I'm wondering if you could put in that broader context of the reparations issue.
Certainly, even though this is well-founded in property law, we would be naive to assume people won't see this as a reparations lawsuit. However, we understand that courts don't want to create laws. They leave that for the legislature. But make no mistake about it, it is landmark in its scope because it will be the first time that descendants of African slaves in America have been compensated in any way, fashion, or form from an American institution. And remember, Harvard is readily believed to be the leading American educational institution with an endowment of $30 billion. These photographs have invaluable meaning to Ms. Lanier, but also to many people who are descendants of slaves. And why should it be locked away at Harvard University? Why shouldn't these daguerreotypes, these photographs, be used to tour the country and be able to talk about these issues of white supremacy that we thought we had overcome, but we know from Charlottesville, Virginia, in recent years that it has been in vogue again to express that white supremacy may not be as bad as we as society has proved it to be by many people, and to have the President of the United States say that there were good people on both sides is even more alarming. It makes Renty's fight even more relevant. And the young people, students all around the country, have been signing petitions and starting to have marches to free Renty. It really heartens me, and it reminds me of what I did in college with Nelson Mandela when we were talking about the need to have an abolishment of apartheid in South Africa. So we take great solace regardless of what happens in the court of law, because they don't always get it right. But we take great solace in knowing that we're on the right side of history, and Harvard is not on the right side of history.
Finally, Tamara Lanier, we give you the last word. What do you want to see happen to these photographs?
Well, I certainly want to consider all of the options. The one thing that I have talked about with my attorneys and with my family is it's important for me that people know who Renty is, and also who Renty was and who Agassiz was. And I hope that there's a greater education or reteaching of history so that we can dispute the legacy that Agassiz has kind of stained my family with.
His name is all over Harvard.
His name is all over Harvard. His name is all over this country and parts of South Carolina and the world. And I think that that's also an interesting point to share. I'm not only getting support from people all over this country, I'm getting international support. And I heard from a young lady in Helsinki, Finland, the other day, where she said the world is watching. And it's because she believes that the United States has never atoned for the sins of slavery. And she believes that this case will be that first opportunity.
Well, I want to thank you, Tamara Lanier, for joining us today. She is suing Harvard for the return of the images of her ancestors, her great-great-great-grandfather, Papa Renty, and his daughter, Delia. And thank you very much in Dallas, Ben Crump, famed civil rights attorney, who is representing Tamara. We will follow this case. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, solitary, unbroken by 4 decades in solitary confinement. The story of Albert Woodfox, held in solitary longer than any person in the United States, out after 43 years. Stay with us.
I won't jump the fence and wash my face in the creek, but I'm back myself. I want to sweep that cow right off her feet, but I'm back Is he
Black Myself by our Native Daughters. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we spend the rest of the hour with a former political prisoner who was held in solitary confinement for 43 years until he won his freedom just over 3 years ago. Albert Woodfox is now traveling the world to discuss his new memoir, Solitary, Unbroken by 4 decades in solitary confinement, my story of transformation and hope. In it, he writes about his childhood and how his mother struggled to keep the family cared for, how as a teenager and a young man he was in and out of jails and prisons, and how he became radicalized when he met members of the Black Panther Party and went on to establish the first chapter of the organization at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. To address horrific conditions at the former cotton plantation. Not long after this, he and fellow prisoner Herman Wallace were accused in 1972 of stabbing prison guard Brent Miller. The two men always maintained their innocence, saying they were targeted because of their political activity. Woodfox, Wallace, and a third man, Robert King, became collectively known as the Angola Three. For decades, Amnesty International and other groups campaigned for their release.
Robert King was freed in 2001 when his conviction that he'd killed a fellow inmate was overturned. Herman Wallace was freed in 2013, only after a federal judge threatened to jail the warden of Angola prison if he refused to release him that day. Wallace died 1 day later of liver cancer. But Louisiana refused to release Albert Woodfox until years later. The state successfully tried him a second time in 1998 after his first conviction was overturned. Then in 2014, a federal judge ruled he should be set free on the basis of racial discrimination in his retrial. When Louisiana Attorney General Buddy Caldwell announced plans to try Woodfox yet again, U.S. Middle District Court Judge James Brady ordered his release, but the U.S. Fifth Circuit then approved Woodfox's continued detention. Then, after being held in isolation in a 6-by-9-foot cell almost continuously for 43 years, Woodfox was released on his 69th birthday, February 19, 2016. After he entered a plea of no contest to charges of manslaughter and aggravated burglary. When he left the jail, where he'd been held pending his trial, his first stop was to visit the grave site of his mother, who died while he was in prison.
I need to go and say goodbye to my mother. I wasn't allowed to go to a funeral when I was in Angola, and my sister as well.
That was 2016. Now, 2 years later, Albert Woodfox joins us here in our New York studio to discuss his incredible new memoir, Solitary, Unbroken by 4 decades in solitary confinement, my story of transformation and hope. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Albert Woodfox. We spoke to you the day after you were released. We have followed your case for so long. I was just thinking about the time that you and Robert King, you were in prison, Robert King was free, you were the Angola Three, went to visit Herman Wallace to say goodbye to him. He was dying in prison, dying of cancer. And as Robert came in from the free world and you were brought in shackles, you both learned that the judge had demanded Herman Wallace be freed immediately. And is it true you were the ones who gave Herman that news?
Well, it was a momentous occasion, and it was totally, something that none of us had expected. The reason Robert and I were there is that for years the state of Louisiana had denied us the right to meet with our attorney as a group. And finally, our attorneys went to court, and Judge Brady ordered them to allow us to have group sessions with our attorney. So what the state did was they moved Herman to the farthest southern part of the state, and they created a CCR tier in a correctional facility called Wade, which is at the utmost northern part of the state, to make it very difficult for our attorneys to have group counseling. And so as a result of that, I had to travel. It was some 6 or 7 hours each time we had the thing.
And this was, though, your last time seeing Herman?
Well, we actually had 3 visits. The first visit, Herman had just got the diagnosis because, up to a certain point, the state medical staff was telling him he had an allergy. And it was only after our attorneys hired a generic doctor to come in and examine both Herman and I that they transferred him to a hospital in New Orleans, and he got the diagnosis that he had liver cancer.
I wanted to go to a clip of Herman, in his own words, describing the impact of solitary confinement on his body. He spoke in phone calls from the prison that were featured in the documentary Herman's House.
Being in a cage for such an extended period of time, it has its downfall. I mean, you may not feel it, you may not know it, you may think that you're okay, and you just perfunctorily move about, However, when it was removed from out of that type of situation and placed in an open environment where, you're even breathing that oxygen and it's getting into your lungs and you're feeling something, growing within you, and you begin to develop a different mode within your body. I even watch my body. I looked in the mirror and I've seen muscles and begin to pop out there. I begin to run even faster. And I'm saying, oh, what the hell is going on here? Much was preserved. But then I got locked up again after 8 months. And being locked up like that, the whole body just got confused.
That's a clip of Herman Wallace speaking in Herman's House. This is Herman describing a dream he had. Listen carefully.
I've had a dream where I got to the front gate and there's a whole lot of people out there. And you ain't gonna believe this, but I was dancing my way out. I was doing the jitterbug. I was doing all kind of crazy, stupid ass, and people was just laughing and clapping, until I walked out that gate. And I remember that dream, and I turned around, and I looked, and there all the brothers was in the window waving and throwing a fist sign, It's rough, man. It really is. It's so real, I can feel it even now, talking about that.
That's Herman Wallace describing what it would feel to be free. You've just celebrated, Albert Woodfox, your 72nd birthday.
Yes, and also the 3rd year of freedom.
And how do you feel today? How have you adjusted after 43 years in prison?
Well, hopeful. Robin and I still travel around across America and outside of America to talk about solitary confinement, which we believe is the most horrible and brutal non-physical attack upon a human being by another human being. Throughout my 4 decades plus of solitary confinement, I've watched men go insane. I've watched men physically hurt themselves, trying to deal with the pressure of being confined to a 9-by-6 cell, 23 hours out of every 24-hour period. And being free now, I still suffer claustrophobic attacks. I'm able to address them better now because my physical movement is beyond 9 feet now. And so, I can walk in my house, I can go in the backyard of my house, I can go on the sidewalk, or there's a park, which I often visit a block and a half away from my house. So the only remedy for me when I had claustrophobic attacks was the space, So this has made it easier to deal with
I wanted to go back, because your book is really a gripping account, since so much of your life, of your adult life, was spent in and out of jails, and then, of course, in Angola. If you could talk somewhat about your early childhood, and you were, as you begin in the book, you say you were born in the Negro wing of the charity hospital, and talk about your early days in the family, the time you spent with a stepfather who was in the military, so you were traveling around, living in different parts of the country?
Yes. I would imagine, my childhood, you're aware of your condition based upon a level of consciousness. And so, my childhood was typical, I would imagine, and because I had nothing to compare it to, I knew better lifestyle. My dad was a career military man. He served in the Navy for 20-plus years, and at some point in time, he was mustered out. He was forced to retire, and being a master chief, and he was in charge of the galleys on an aircraft carrier. He had a great deal of responsibility and respect. But after, and there's the world of the military, and there's the world of reality. So after being mustered out, we moved back to a small town in North Carolina, LaGrange, and we lived, and the world of reality began to get in, where he was constantly being disrespected. It was difficult to get a job, thing, and it affected him in a way where he became abusive. And the abuse got to the point where my aunties pleaded with my mom to leave, because she felt as though if we would stay there, he would eventually he might kill him in one of his rages. And so, from that point on, I became, a single parent house. And my mom, was functionally illiterate. She could only read or write and name. But as time went on, and I began to realize that in spite of this handicap, she was one of the most wisest women I had ever known. And even to this day, there's a poem in my book called Echoes. Even to this day, there are times when I'm perplexed by a situation that I can hear echoes of some of the things she would say to me. And she still, serves me as well as she did when I was a child,
We're going to come back to this discussion. Albert Woodfox, longest-standing solitary confinement prisoner in the United States, held in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell almost continuously for 43 years, released just over 2 years ago. We'll be back with him in 30 seconds. Jackie's First Letter by Ken Meir. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest, Albert Woodfox, author of now his memoir, Solitary, Unbroken by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, My Story of Transformation and Hope.
Well, Albert, you talked about that your mother eventually left your father, and she moved back to New Orleans, where her family was, and that's where you initially you recount how you got involved in a bunch of petty incidents with police and arrested. You eventually end up in the New Orleans Parish jail, where you discover that there's a whole wing of prisoners that are Black Panthers. And could you talk about your first involvement with those members of the Black Panthers, and then what happens in New York when you come across in the Manhattan House of Detention many of the Panther 21?
Well, actually, you know, my first encounter with the Panther up in personal and close was in Harlem, New York. And eventually, you know...
you had escaped from jail at one point and fled
after
to New York, right?
50 years, the day I was sentenced to 50 years, I escaped. And eventually I wound up in Harlem. But this was a different Harlem from the Harlem I had known in my criminal life. You know, I saw, you know, members of the Black Panther Party moving in the community. I saw them, you know, helping senior citizens. I saw them, you know, in charge of cleaning up the neighborhoods and stuff. And the thing that impressed me the most, though, you know, all my life I had always been able to see a certain fear in black people. No matter what position they held, you know, I could always sense that fear. And for the very first time in my life, I saw black men and women who had no fear. This fear, I couldn't sense it. I couldn't feel it. You know, but what I did feel was a sense of pride, a sense of dignity, a sense of dedication. And luckily, you know, a police car was patrolling. And the fear that I normally saw in black people, I saw in these police officers, you know, and so that was quite a, you know, an impact. And eventually I was arrested and was placed in a Manhattan house of detention. And while there, the Panther 21 incident, a shootout with New York police occurred, and 4 members were placed on, I was on the 8th floor in a cell block, and 4 members from that group were placed there, and Panther by the name of Alfred Kane was in leadership position. And the Panthers immediately start to make an impact, you know, in conversations, and so, you know, that was my first real close-up counter with the Panthers. But the turning point in my life, a guy who had come down on appeal had a book called A Different Drummer. And, you know, up to that point, I was listening to what the Panthers were saying at the meetings on the tier, but I wasn't hearing what they were saying. And after reading this book, I started hearing, understanding what they were saying. And so, in hindsight, so many things that had happened to me, I realized that, you know, it was, you know, not it was not because I was bad. It was because I was black. And that, you know, at that time, they had determined that 1 in every 4 black men would go to prison. And unfortunately, I was that 1 in 4 that wound up in prison.
So you end up in solitary confinement for close to 43 years?
Well, actually, it was 44 years and 10 months. But there were a few breaks in between that. I was granted a new trial. I discharged on my original prison sentence in '96, and I was transferred to Tangible Hope Parish, where venue had been changed by the courts, and placed in the Amid City Jail. And so, you know, I remained there from '98 and to April '98 until December after I had been reconvicted.
And you write, gassing prisoners was the #1 response by security to deal with any prisoner in Angola who demanded to be treated with dignity. In the 70s, we were gassed so often every prisoner in CCR almost became immune to the tear gas. You were being gassed in solitary confinement.
Yeah, well, you know, the sergeants were provided with these little, it's like a little deodorant can, you know. And if you would try to get a certain, like, more toilet paper, or you complaining about the toilet in your cell not working, you know, and if the officer didn't like the way you were talking, you know, or if you were trying to defend yourself for being handling a disrespectful man and stuff, you know, they would squirt the gas in your face, you know. And usually that would be followed by, they would come into your cell and beat you and handcuff you, then bring you and put you in what's called a dungeon, you know.
In the book, you describe very graphically the situation at Angola when you first got there, before you were in solitary, and the rampant rapes that were occurring in the prison. And once you became politically conscious and you were returned there, you talk about how you insisted that on in your section that there was going to be no more rapes. And talk about that and the impact that your political organizing had on the way you dealt with your fellow prisoners.
Well, the incident that started the prison chapter of the party to form anti-rape squads was, I was in my dormitory. I was housed in Hickory 4 at that time, and this young kid was assigned a bed across from me. And the saddest thing I've ever witnessed in my life is to look at another human being and see that his spirit has been shattered. And this kid, he was just sitting there, and I could see tears rolling out of his eyes, and I always have believed that in life, an individual or incident raises your level of consciousness. And so once your level of consciousness is raised, you become aware of whatever conditions, individuals, and so how you respond to that, is pretty much determined on that level of consciousness. And I think at that moment that I said, I can no longer accept this. I can no longer tolerate this. So the next day I had a talk with Harmon Wallace, and we used to go out on the football field. That's how we used to have our meetings, like we were practicing football, throwing the football around and having political discussions and stuff. And so we discussed with the other members about, the rape and slave trade that was going on in Angola. And so we decided to start providing protection for these kids coming in, to let them know that they had other options other than being made victims, And, well, usually, kids 16, 17 years old come in.
Before we end, how did you maintain your sanity? 44 years in solitary confinement.
Well, I think the fact that, I was a member of the Black Panther Party, I had a political conscience, I had values and principles instilled by, my mom that I grew into. I didn't realize how much my mom had, had set a foundation in me, even though I was resisting it. And, over the decades, there was, we had programs geared toward making the men better. We had schools. We used to hold schools and political classes. And but, as many battles as we won, as many men as we saved, as many men as we helped to keep their sanity, we lost, twice as many men, And, there were times when, I had to fight really hard for my own sanity, and I think the fact that what I was doing, throughout all this, I developed an unbelievable love for humanity and dedicated, myself to doing whatever I could to better humanity. And so I remember reading something from Mr. Mandela, and he said, if a cause is noble, you can carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I thought what we were doing was a noble cause. So we were prepared. And so the beatings and the gassings and the decades of solitary confinement, was really, although painful and difficult, it never got to the point where they were able to break us.
We're going to leave it there now and do part 2 and post it online at democracynow.org. Albert Woodfox's book, Solitary, Unbroken by 4 Decades in Solitary Confinement, My Story of Transformation and Hope. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.